In 1858, North Carolina, Moses and Charity had suffered enough under 3 brutal overseers. But during the wild Mardi Gras celebrations, they finally found their perfect chance to strike back. How did they use the carnival's joy to mask their deadly revenge plan? Before moving to the story, please tell us which country you're watching from. Subscribe for more amazing hidden historical stories. North Carolina, February 1858. Winter cold still bit through the thin walls of slave cabins, but something different filled the air around Riverside Plantation. Music, laughter, the smell of rich food cooking in the big house kitchen. Mardi Gras had come to Carolina. Master Henry Beaumont had spent time in New Orleans learning the cotton trade. He brought back more than business knowledge. He brought back a love for carnival celebrations. Every February, he threw elaborate parties that lasted 3 days and nights. The plantation transformed during Mardi Gras season. Colorful banners hung from the mansion's white columns. Paper lanterns glowed like fireflies in the oak trees. Carriages arrived from neighboring plantations carrying guests in fancy costumes. Ladies wore silk gowns with feathered masks. Gentlemen dressed like French kings and Spanish nobles. But the celebration had 2 faces, one for the masters, one for the enslaved. In the big house, crystal glasses clinked with expensive wine. A full orchestra played waltzes and quadrilles. Tables groaned under platters of roasted pig and sugared cakes. White folks danced until dawn in rooms lit by hundreds of candles. In the slave quarters, people huddled around small fires trying to stay warm. They listened to the distant music and tried to ignore their empty stomachs. Children pressed their faces against cabin windows, watching the pretty lights they could never touch. Master Beaumont allowed his slaves one small taste of carnival joy. On Fat Tuesday night, they could wear simple masks made from corn husks and scraps of cloth. They could dance to fiddle music in the dirt yard between their cabins. They got extra portions of food and a cup of watered-down wine. But 3 overseers made sure the celebration never got out of hand. Thomas Pike was the head overseer, 45 years old with gray hair and cold gray eyes. He carried a bullwhip everywhere and used it often. Pike had worked on plantations from Virginia to Georgia. He knew every trick slaves used to avoid work. More importantly, he knew every punishment that kept them afraid. Dancing and singing make slaves forget their place, Pike often told the other overseers. Got to remind them who's boss even during party time. Jake Morrison was Pike's right hand, 32 years old and built like a bull. He had fists like hammers and a temper that exploded without warning. Morrison enjoyed hurting people. The screams and begging made him smile. The third overseer was Billy Watts, only 25 but already cruel as a snake. Watts came from a poor white family and hated that slaves sometimes ate better than he did growing up. He took out his anger with his fists and a wooden club he called Old Hickory. During Mardi Gras week, the 3 overseers worked extra shifts. They watched every slave gathering, listened to every conversation, made sure the temporary freedom didn't give anyone dangerous ideas about permanent freedom. The contrast was sharp as broken glass. In the big house, white folks celebrated life and joy. In the slave quarters, people endured survival and sorrow. The same moon shone on both worlds, but only one world got to dance beneath it without fear. Moses Washington watched the carnival preparations from his position at the Blacksmith forge. 28 years old with arms like iron from years of metalwork. He made horseshoes and tools by day. By night, he made other things in secret, things that could cut rope or break locks. Moses had been planning something for months, something that would balance the scales during this year's celebration. His partner in the plan was Charity Adams, 26 years old and beautiful despite the scars on her back. She worked in the big house kitchen and heard everything the white folks said. Charity knew which guests were arriving when. She knew the overseer's schedules. Most importantly, she knew how to move through the big house without being seen. Together, Moses and Charity had decided that this Mardi Gras would be different. This year, the carnival would claim 3 very special victims, 3 men who had caused too much pain for too many years. The music playing in the big house sounded happy and bright. But Moses heard something else in those notes. He heard the rhythm of justice, the melody of revenge. Fat Tuesday was 3 days away. They called themselves the Midnight Council. Just 2 people who met in secret places where white eyes couldn't see them. The old tobacco barn after the moon went down. The cypress swamp where snakes kept better watch than any overseer. The root cellar beneath the abandoned cabin where field hands used to live before fever took them all. Moses Washington and Charity Adams had their own reasons for wanting the 3 overseers dead. Each one brought something special to their deadly plan. Moses was their leader. 28 years old with muscles like iron from working the blacksmith forge since he was 12. He stood 6 feet tall and moved like a cat despite his size. Moses could read and write, skills he learned by watching the master's children study. But he kept his intelligence hidden behind a mask of humble obedience. Moses had worked at Riverside Plantation for 16 years. He knew every inch of that property, which doors stayed unlocked at night, where the tools and weapons were stored, how the big house worked during party celebrations. Most importantly, he knew the 3 overseers' habits and weaknesses. Knowledge is power, Moses told Charity during one of their midnight meetings. Even slaves can learn things that masters don't expect us to know. But Moses's knowledge came with a terrible price. Last winter, his younger brother Samuel had been caught trying to escape. Overseer Thomas Pike decided to make an example of the boy. He whipped Samuel so hard that the young man died 3 days later from his wounds. "They killed my brother for wanting freedom," Moses said, his voice flat as still water. Maybe it's time they learned what real punishment feels like. Charity Adams was Moses's partner in both love and revenge, 26 years old with quick hands and quicker ears. She worked in the big house kitchen and heard everything the white folks said when they thought no slaves were listening. Charity knew about secret business deals, about which guests were coming for Mardi Gras, about the overseer's schedules and routines. Charity moved through the big house like a shadow. She served food to the master's family and cleaned their rooms. She prepared meals for fancy dinner parties and washed dishes afterward. But she also gathered information that could destroy the people who owned her. "Rich white folks think we're invisible," Charity whispered to Moses. "They talk about whipping slaves and selling families like we ain't even human. But invisible people see everything, and we remember everything too." Charity's own sister had been sold away 2 years ago to pay Master Beaumont's gambling debts. Little Rose was only 14 years old when the traders took her. Charity never saw her sister again. Master Beaumont told Charity she should be grateful, said Rose would learn proper manners on a Charleston house plantation. But Charity knew the truth about young girls on Charleston plantations. She had heard the whispered stories from other enslaved women. Rose was probably dead by now, and Master Beaumont slept peacefully in his fine bed every night, never thinking about the child he had sold like livestock. "He sold my sister to pay his card debts," Charity said during one council meeting. Time he learned that some debts can't be paid with other people's lives. The two had found each other 3 years ago during a Christmas celebration. Moses was playing fiddle music for the slaves' small party. Charity was serving leftover food from the master's holiday feast. Their eyes met across the crowded cabin. Something sparked between them like flint striking steel. They began meeting in secret, talking about their dreams and their pain. Moses taught Charity how to read using scraps of newspaper. Charity taught Moses how to move through the big house without making noise. Together, they discovered they were stronger than either could be alone. But their love grew alongside their anger. Every cruel punishment they witnessed made them burn hotter for justice. Every family torn apart by slave sales added fuel to their fire. Every child beaten for small mistakes convinced them that their masters deserved death. The three overseers had pushed too far for too long. Thomas Pike killed Moses's brother with a whip. Jake Morrison had beaten Charity unconscious for dropping a plate. Billy Watts sold Charity's sister to pay his own gambling debts. "We can keep taking their beatings and watch more people die," Moses said during their final planning meeting. "Or we can fight back." "Fighting back means we probably die too," Charity replied honestly. "Maybe. But at least we'd die free." Together, these two people had everything they needed for their plan. Moses had the knowledge of the plantation and the skills to make weapons. Charity had access to the big house and information about everyone's movements. Most importantly, they had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. They spent months planning every detail, watching the overseers' routines, learning about the Mardi Gras celebrations, preparing for the night when justice would finally be served in masks and music. Mardi Gras was perfect for their plan. 3 days of chaos and celebration, guests coming and going at all hours, music loud enough to cover screams, masked figures moving through darkness, the perfect time for 3 cruel men to meet their judgment. Moses looked at Charity in the flickering candlelight of their secret meeting place. She was beautiful and brave and willing to die for freedom. He loved her more than life itself. "This is for Samuel and Rose," he said quietly, "and for everyone else they've hurt." "This is for justice," Charity replied. That night was coming soon. The breaking point came on the Sunday before Fat Tuesday. Little Benjamin Adams was only 10 years old. He had bright brown eyes and a gap-toothed smile that made everyone laugh. His mama Charity worked in the big house kitchen. His daddy had been sold to Alabama 3 years ago. Benjamin was all the family Charity had left in the world. That morning, Benjamin was helping hang decorations for the Mardi Gras celebration. Paper lanterns and colorful streamers needed to go up around the big house. The work was too delicate for adult hands. Children could climb ladders and reach tight spaces where grown folks couldn't fit. Benjamin balanced on a wooden ladder against the mansion's white columns. He stretched up high to hang a purple banner between 2 pillars. The ladder wobbled under his small weight, but he kept working because Overseer Billy Watts was watching from below. "Move faster, you lazy little monkey," Watts shouted up at the boy. "We ain't got all day for your slow hands." Benjamin tried to work quicker, but the banner was heavy for such small arms. His hands shook as he struggled to tie the ribbons. The ladder swayed back and forth like a tree in a storm. Then disaster struck. The banner slipped from Benjamin's fingers. It fluttered down like a giant bird and landed right on Billy Watts's head. The overseer stumbled backward, cursing and clawing at the purple cloth that covered his face. Other slaves working nearby stopped what they were doing. They held their breath and waited for the explosion they knew was coming. Everyone knew Billy Watts's temper. They knew what happened to slaves who embarrassed him in front of others. "What did you just do, you worthless little devil?" Watts roared, pulling the banner off his head. Benjamin started crying. He climbed down the ladder as fast as his shaking legs could move. "I'm sorry, Master Watts. I didn't mean to drop it. My hands got tired and it slipped." But Billy Watts was beyond listening to apologies. The laughter from other plantation guests had poisoned his brain. His rage took control of his body, like fire spreading through dry wood. "Sorry ain't good enough," he snarled, pulling his wooden club from his belt. "Time you learned what happens to slaves who make me look like a fool." The first blow caught Benjamin across the shoulders. The second hit his back. The third struck his head so hard something cracked like an eggshell. Other slaves heard him screaming and came running, but they knew better than to interfere when an overseer was disciplining a child. Charity Adams heard her son's cries from inside the big house kitchen. She dropped the pot she was stirring and ran toward the front yard as fast as her legs could carry her. But by the time she reached him, it was too late. Little Benjamin lay still on the ground beside the fallen ladder. His brown eyes stared at nothing. His chest didn't rise or fall. Blood trickled from his ear like a tiny red stream. Billy Watts stood over his small body, breathing hard from the beating he had just delivered. "Should have taught him to be more careful," Watts said to Charity without shame. "Clean up this mess and get back to work." Charity knelt beside her son's broken body. Her hands shook as she gathered him into her arms. He felt so light, so small, like a baby bird with crushed wings. 20 field hands watched in silence as she carried him away from the spot where he died. That night, Moses found Charity sitting by their son's body in the cabin they shared. She hadn't spoken a word since Benjamin's death. She just sat there staring at his peaceful face, stroking his hair like he was sleeping. "They killed our baby over a drop banner," Moses said, his voice steady as stone. "Beat him to death for a simple accident." Charity finally looked up. Her eyes were dry, but burning with something colder than tears. "That man ain't human. No human being beats a child to death over party decorations." But Benjamin's murder wasn't the only horror that Mardi Gras week had brought. The 3 overseers seemed to be competing to see who could cause the most suffering during carnival preparations. Thomas Pike had whipped 3 field hands the day before. Their crime was moving too slowly while carrying tables for the outdoor feast. 2 men and 1 woman got 20 lashes each for taking rest breaks in the February cold. "Can't have lazy slaves ruining Master Beaumont's party," Pike announced to the gathered workers. "Anyone else who can't keep up will get the same treatment." Jake Morrison had beaten an elderly slave named Abraham with his bare fists. The old man's offense was spilling lamp oil while filling lanterns for the celebration. Morrison's knuckles left bloody marks on Abraham's face and ribs. "Clumsy old fool wasted expensive oil," Morrison explained to the other overseers. "Had to teach him a lesson about being wasteful." The cruelty was getting worse every day. The 3 overseers pushed their slaves harder and harder during carnival preparations. More work for less rest. More beatings for smaller mistakes. More children suffering for adult entertainment. "They treating us worse than animals," Moses said, his blacksmith's hands clenched into fists. "Animals get better care than we do." Charity looked down at Benjamin's still face, her 10-year-old son who would never laugh again, never climb another ladder, never see another sunrise, dead because a white man's pride was worth more than a black child's life. "Question is, what we gonna do about it?" she said quietly. "We can keep taking their beatings and watch more children die. Or we can fight back." Moses knew what fighting back meant. Dead white men, manhunts with bloodhounds, slaves hanging from trees as examples to others. But he also knew what not fighting back meant. More children beaten to death, more families destroyed, more people dying for the entertainment of masters who saw them as less than human. Moses looked around their small cabin at the life they had built together. The corn-husk dolls Charity made for Benjamin. The wooden toys Moses carved during winter evenings. The small family that Billy Watts had destroyed with a wooden club. "My son died today for dropping a banner," Moses said quietly. "How many more children got to die before we say enough?" Charity touched Benjamin's cold hand one final time. Then she looked at Moses with eyes that burned like coals. "Enough," she whispered. The 3 overseers had pushed too far, used their power to destroy too many lives, caused too much pain during what should have been a time of joy. Now it was time for them to learn what real suffering felt like. Time for the carnival to claim 3 very special victims. The planning began that very night. While Master Beaumont's guests danced in the big house, Moses and Charity planned 3 funerals that would happen during the Mardi Gras celebration. Fat Tuesday was 2 days away. Every scar told a story. Every mark on their bodies was a memory burned into flesh by the 3 men who now walked around Riverside Plantation like kings. Moses and Charity carried their histories like maps written in pain. Each one had traveled different roads to this moment, but they both ended up under the same brutal overseers. Moses Washington came to North Carolina in chains when he was 12 years old. Born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, he watched his mama sold to a sugar planter in Louisiana. His daddy went to cotton fields in Mississippi. The slave traders loaded Moses onto a wagon with 10 other children, all of them crying for families they would never see again. Master Henry Beaumont bought Moses at the Wilmington slave market for $300. The boy was strong for his age and smart enough to learn blacksmith work. Beaumont needed skilled slaves to handle his growing plantation business. But Moses's real education came from pain and watching. He learned to read by studying punishment lists that overseers posted in the slave quarters. He memorized numbers by counting lashes given to other slaves. Most importantly, he learned how the plantation worked, which buildings stayed unlocked at night, where weapons and tools were stored, how the big house operated during celebrations and normal days. Thomas Pike broke Moses into plantation life with his whip. The head overseer believed young slaves needed to learn fear early. For Moses's first month at Riverside, Pike found reasons to beat him every single day. Didn't work fast enough, looked at white folks wrong, asked too many questions. Smart slaves are dangerous slaves, Pike told the other overseers while Moses bled in the dirt. Got to break that spirit before it grows into rebellion. But Pike's beatings didn't break Moses's spirit. They taught him to hide it, to smile and say yes, sir, while planning revenge in his heart. Every lash made him stronger and more determined to survive. Jake Morrison taught Moses about sudden violence. The young overseer had fists like hammers and enjoyed using them without warning. He would walk up to slaves working in the fields and punch them in the stomach just to watch them fall. He called it keeping them alert. When Moses turned 16, Morrison decided the young blacksmith was getting too confident, too skilled, too respected by other slaves. So Morrison beat Moses unconscious with a piece of iron pipe, left him lying in the blacksmith shop for 2 days without medical care. That boy was getting uppity ideas, Morrison explained to Master Beaumont. Had to remind him who's in charge around here. Moses survived the beating, but never forgot it. The iron pipe left permanent scars on his back and shoulders. More importantly, it left permanent hatred in his heart. Billy Watts was the cruelest of the 3 overseers because he enjoyed causing fear. He would sneak up on slaves in the middle of the night and drag them from their cabins for imaginary crimes. He made children watch while he whipped their parents. He sold families apart just to see them cry. When Moses was 25, Watts sold his younger brother Samuel to a cotton plantation in Georgia. The boy's only crime was learning to read by watching Moses practice letters in the dirt. Watts claimed that educated slaves were planning escape attempts. Can't have slaves thinking they're smart as white folks, Watts announced at the slave auction. This boy needs to learn his place on a real plantation. Moses never saw Samuel again. Letters smuggled back from Georgia said the boy died from overwork within 2 years. But Moses carried his brother's memory like a burning coal in his chest. Charity Adams had her own collection of scars and memories. She came to Riverside Plantation when she was 18 years old. Master Beaumont bought her from a bankrupt rice planter in South Carolina. Charity cost $600 because she could cook, clean, sew, and read. But her real value was in what she heard and remembered. Working in the big house meant listening to conversations that white folks thought were private. Charity learned about business deals and family secrets, about which plantations were buying slaves and which were selling them, about the three overseers' weaknesses and fears. Thomas Pike had a drinking problem that got worse every year. He kept whiskey bottles hidden in the barn and stable. By evening, he was usually too drunk to think clearly or fight effectively. Jake Morrison was afraid of fire. His family's house had burned down when he was a child. The smell of smoke made him panic and run away instead of investigating the source. Billy Watts had gambling debts all over North Carolina. He owed money to dangerous men in Wilmington and Charlotte. Sometimes he sold slaves to pay what he owed instead of giving the money to Master Beaumont. Charity gathered this information like a spider collecting flies. She knew it would be useful someday when the time came for justice. Her own torture came from watching her family destroyed piece by piece. First, her parents sold to different plantations when she was 15. Then, her younger sister Rose sold to pay Master Beaumont's card debts. Finally, her son Benjamin, beaten to death by Billy Watts over a dropped banner. Each loss added fuel to the fire burning in her heart. Each separation taught her that white people saw black families as property to be divided and sold for profit. Each death showed her that mercy was not coming from her masters. Now Moses and Charity had everything they needed for their deadly plan: knowledge of the plantation and its secrets, information about the three overseers' weaknesses, skills in metalwork and kitchen work. Most importantly, they had nothing left to lose. The carnival celebration would hide their movements. The music would cover any sounds of struggle. The masks would conceal their identities until it was too late for their victims to escape. 3 men had caused too much pain for too many years. Tomorrow night, during the height of Mardi Gras festivities, that pain would finally be repaid with interest. Justice was coming to Riverside Plantation, and it would arrive wearing carnival masks. Fat Tuesday, February 23, 1858. The night pressed down on Riverside Plantation like a heavy curtain soaked in secrets. Music drifted from the big house where white folks danced in silk gowns and fancy. Masks, lanterns glowed like fireflies in the oak trees. Carriages rolled up the long driveway, carrying more guests for Master Beaumont's grand celebration. But tonight, the carnival would claim 3 very special victims. Moses Washington adjusted his cornhusk mask and checked the knife hidden in his belt. 28 years old and ready to balance the scales of justice. He had spent months planning this night, studying the overseers' routines, learning their weaknesses, preparing for the moment when their cruelty would finally be repaid. Charity Adams touched the poison bottle concealed in her apron pocket. 26 years old and burning for revenge. She knew every inch of the big house, every guest who would be attending, every moment when the 3 overseers would be vulnerable and alone. The carnival celebration provided perfect cover for their deadly work. Music loud enough to muffle screams, masked figures moving through darkness, chaos and confusion that would hide their movements until it was too late. Their first target was Billy Watts, the youngest overseer with the cruelest heart, the man who had beaten 10-year-old Benjamin to death over a dropped banner. Tonight, he would pay for that child's blood. Watts was drinking in the stable with 2 guests from a neighboring plantation. They were telling stories about slave punishments and laughing at the pain they had caused. Empty whiskey bottles lay scattered on the hay-covered floor. Moses crept through the shadows like a hunting cat. His blacksmith's muscles moved silently despite his size. Years of metalwork had taught him patience and precision. Tonight, those skills would serve justice instead of masters. Charity approached from the other direction. She carried a tray of food and more whiskey for the drinking men, just another invisible slave serving her betters. But the bottle in her hand contained more than corn liquor. "Brought you some fresh drinks, Master Watts," Charity said in her sweetest voice. "Master Beaumont thought you might be getting thirsty." Watts grabbed the bottle without looking at her face. Slaves were furniture to him. tools that moved and served and suffered for his entertainment. He never saw the hatred burning in Charity's eyes. "About time," Watts slurred, already drunk from hours of celebration. "Been telling these gentlemen about that lazy boy I had to discipline yesterday. Little devil dropped a banner right on my head." The visiting planters laughed at his story. They thought beating children was funny, entertainment for men who owned other human beings. Watts tilted the poisoned bottle to his lips and drank deeply. The arsenic Charity had stolen from the rat poison would work slowly. He would have time to realize what was happening. Time to understand that his victims had finally struck back. Within minutes, Watts began clutching his stomach. His face turned pale as moonlight. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the February cold. "Something's wrong," he gasped, doubling over in pain. "Feel like my insides are burning." The visiting planters thought he was just drunk. They kept laughing and drinking while Billy Watts writhed on the stable floor. By the time they realized something was seriously wrong, it was too late. Moses slipped away in the confusion. 1 down, 2 to go. Their second target was Jake Morrison, the overseer with fists like hammers and a love of sudden violence, the man who had beaten Moses unconscious with an iron pipe. Tonight those hammering fists would be stilled forever. Morrison was patrolling the slave quarters, making sure no one was planning trouble during the carnival celebrations. He carried a lantern in one hand and a wooden club in the other. Violence followed him like a faithful dog. Moses waited in the shadows between 2 cabins. He held a length of rope he had braided himself, strong enough to hold a 1,000-pound horse, strong enough to strangle a man who deserved to die. Morrison walked past without seeing the danger lurking in the darkness. Moses moved like lightning. The rope went around the overseer's thick neck before he could cry out. The lantern fell and shattered on the ground. Oil spread across the dirt and caught fire. Morrison clawed at the rope, cutting off his air. His club fell from nerveless fingers. He was strong, but Moses was stronger. Years of working iron had given the blacksmith muscles like steel cables. "This is for my brother Samuel," Moses whispered in Morrison's ear as the man struggled and died. "This is for every slave you ever hurt." The fire from the broken lantern began spreading to nearby grass. Moses stamped it out quickly. "No need to burn down the whole plantation. Just remove the men who made it hell on earth. 2 down, 1 to go." Their final target was Thomas Pike, the head overseer with gray hair and cold gray eyes, the man who had whipped Samuel Washington to death for learning to read, the leader of all the cruelty that happened at Riverside Plantation. Pike was in the big house enjoying Master Beaumont's party. He wore a fancy mask and danced with plantation ladies, acting like a gentleman instead of the monster he really was. Charity moved through the crowded rooms like a ghost. She knew every hallway and staircase, every door that led to dark corners where screams wouldn't be heard over the music. Pike left the dance floor and walked toward the back porch for fresh air. Too much wine and too much dancing had made him dizzy. He needed quiet and darkness to clear his head. But quiet and darkness were exactly what Moses and Charity needed too. Pike stepped onto the back porch and breathed deeply. The February air felt good after the stuffy ballroom. Music and laughter drifted through the open windows behind him. Moses emerged from the shadows like death itself. He carried his blacksmith's hammer, the same tool he used to shape iron into horseshoes and nails. Tonight it would shape justice into reality. "Remember my brother Samuel?" Moses asked quietly. Pike spun around, but it was too late. The hammer caught him in the temple with a sound like an egg cracking. The head overseer crumpled to the wooden planks without making another sound. 3 men who had caused decades of suffering were finally silent. 3 voices that had ordered beatings and sold families would never speak again. 3 hearts that had felt no mercy had stopped beating forever. The carnival music still played in the big house. Guests still danced and laughed and celebrated, but justice had claimed its own during the Mardi Gras festivities. Moses and Charity stood together on the blood-stained porch. They had avenged their son, Benjamin. They had balanced the scales for all the slaves who had suffered under the three overseers' cruelty. But their work was just beginning. Soon, white folks would discover the bodies. Then the manhunt would start. Wednesday morning came with screams instead of birdsong. The first body was found at dawn in the stable. Billy Watts lay twisted on the hay-covered floor. His face was purple and swollen. Foam had dried around his mouth. The whiskey bottle beside him told only part of the story. The second discovery came an hour later. Jake Morrison hung from a rope behind the slave quarters. His thick neck was bent at an impossible angle. His wooden club lay broken in the dirt below his dangling feet. But the third body was the one that made Master Beaumont's blood run cold. Thomas Pike sprawled on the back porch of the big house. His skull was cracked like an eggshell. Blood had soaked into the wooden planks where carnival guests had danced just hours before. 3 overseers, dead in one night. During the biggest celebration of the year. This was no accident. Sheriff Daniel Crawford arrived before noon with 4 deputies and a face like thunder. 48 years old, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He had dealt with slave troubles in 3 counties, usually ended with quick trials and public hangings. But this was different. This was organized, professional, deadly. The sheriff walked through each crime scene like a hound following a scent. He examined Billy Watts's purple face and the empty poison bottle. He studied Jake Morrison's rope burns and the drag marks in the dirt. He measured the blood patterns around Thomas Pike's crushed skull. Poison, strangling, blunt force trauma, Sheriff Crawford announced to his deputies. 3 different methods, 3 different locations, multiple killers working together. The evidence painted a clear picture for anyone willing to read it. Arsenic stolen from rat poison supplies, rope braided by skilled hands, a blacksmith's hammer used with deadly precision. This wasn't random violence, this was calculated revenge. Someone planned this for months, Deputy James Wilson said, stating what everyone already knew. Multiple someones, Sheriff Crawford corrected. And they knew these men's. Routines knew where they'd be, knew how to kill them without being seen. By afternoon, curious white folks had gathered around the plantation like vultures circling carrion. Neighboring planters and their wives, merchants from nearby towns. Even the mayor of Charlotte made the long ride to see what remained of Riverside security. They whispered among themselves in voices filled with fear and rage. If 3 experienced overseers could be murdered in one night, no white person was safe. The slaves were getting ideas about freedom and revenge. "We need to make examples," said Colonel Robert Hayes from a plantation near Wilmington. "Show these slaves what happens when they forget their place." "Agreed," replied Judge William Parker from Charlotte. "But first, we need to find who did this. Root out the conspiracy before it spreads to other counties." Sheriff Crawford began his investigation at the slave quarters. 20 cabins lined the muddy street like broken teeth. Thin smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played in the dirt while their mothers watched with worried eyes. Fear hung over the quarters, thick as morning fog. Everyone knew what happened when white men died. Innocent people would suffer along with the guilty. That was the way of things in North Carolina. That was the law, written in blood and terror. Moses Washington stood on his cabin porch like he had nothing to hide. His face showed the right amount of shock and confusion. His voice carried the proper tone of a loyal slave concerned about his master's safety. "Terrible thing, Sheriff Crawford," Moses said, shaking his head sadly. "Master Pike was a good man, always treated us fair and square. The lie came easy after years of practice. Slaves learned to hide their true feelings behind masks of submission, to say what white folks wanted to hear instead of what they really thought. But Sheriff Crawford noticed things that most white men missed. How Moses's hand stayed steady when everyone else was shaking. How his eyes never looked directly at the crime scenes. How he seemed more prepared for questions than surprised by them. "Where were you last night between 10 and midnight?" the sheriff asked directly. "Right here in my cabin with my woman Charity," Moses replied without hesitation. "We went to bed early because we had extra work today cleaning up after the party." Charity Adams appeared in the doorway right on cue. Her face showed perfect grief and confusion. She dabbed at her eyes with a torn piece of cloth like she'd been crying all morning. "It's true, Sheriff," she said in a voice that trembled just right. "Moses was here with me all night. We heard some shouting around midnight, but thought it was drunk folks from the party." The alibi sounded reasonable. Married couples sleeping in their own cabin. Nothing unusual about that. But Sheriff Crawford had investigated enough crimes to know that reasonable didn't always mean truthful. He questioned other slaves with similar results. Everyone had perfect stories. Everyone was sleeping in their cabins. Everyone heard sounds but thought they came from the carnival celebration. Everyone seemed shocked and saddened by their overseers' deaths. Too perfect, too coordinated. Like they had practiced their answers beforehand. "This was planned by more than 2 people," Sheriff Crawford told his deputies. "Organized resistance, multiple conspirators working together." The investigation continued into the evening. Deputies searched slave cabins for evidence. They found nothing suspicious. No poison bottles or rope fragments. No blood-stained hammers or clothes. No signs that anyone had been planning murder. But absence of evidence wasn't the same as evidence of innocence. Smart conspirators would have destroyed or hidden anything that could connect them to the crimes. As darkness fell, word spread to neighboring plantations. 3 overseers had been murdered by their own slaves, a coordinated uprising that succeeded beyond anyone's worst nightmares. Panic rippled through North Carolina's plantation country like wildfire. Masters increased security around their homes. They armed their remaining overseers with extra weapons. They watched their own slaves with new suspicion and fear. If it could happen at Riverside Plantation, it could happen anywhere. The manhunt was about to begin in earnest. Thursday morning brought bloodhounds and bounty hunters to Riverside Plantation. Sheriff Crawford arrived with 3 dozen armed men and 8 tracking dogs. The kind of dogs trained to follow human scent through swamps and pine forests. The kind of men who made their living hunting runaway slaves. But Moses and Charity had vanished like smoke in the wind. Their cabin stood empty. Work tools lay abandoned at the Blacksmith forge. Even their few possessions had disappeared during the night. Somewhere between Wednesday evening prayers and Thursday dawn, 2 people had melted into the North Carolina wilderness. The manhunt began at the slave quarters. Bloodhounds sniffed at cold fire pits and empty beds. They picked up scent trails leading toward the Cape Fear River, toward the cypress swamps where alligators ruled and white men feared to follow. Moses had planned their escape route for months. He knew every deer path through the wetlands, every island of solid ground in miles of black water, every hiding place where Spanish moss hung thick enough to conceal human shapes. The 2 fugitives moved like ghosts through water that came up to their chests. Charity carried dried food wrapped in oilcloth. Moses brought tools for building shelters and starting fires. Together they scouted ahead for dangers both human and animal. Behind them, dogs howled like demons in the distance. Men cursed and shouted as they struggled through unfamiliar terrain. But the swamp belonged to people who had hidden there for generations. It protected its children from those who would harm them. For 6 days, the chase continued. Bounty hunters on horseback found their animals useless in the muddy water. Bloodhounds lost scent where creeks joined rivers. Professional trackers admitted defeat in terrain that shifted like quicksand. On the 7th day, search parties found evidence of violence. Torn clothing caught on cypress roots, blood on a fallen log, signs that someone had fought desperately and lost. "Gators got 'em," one bounty hunter declared, pointing at drag marks leading into deep water. Nothing left but bones, and the swamp will keep those secrets forever. Sheriff Crawford agreed reluctantly. 2 fugitives had entered the wetlands. 2 sets of tracks had vanished into water and mud. Whether taken by alligators, quicksand, or their own desperation, the result was the same. The official report listed both suspects as deceased by misadventure while resisting capture. Case closed. Problem solved. Order restored to what remained of Riverside's plantation empire. But riverboat captains told different stories. They spoke of mysterious passengers on moonless nights. Former slaves whispered about helpers who appeared when runaways needed guidance north. Children sang songs about 2 spirits who still watched over those who suffered. The truth disappeared with the fugitives themselves. Whether they died in Carolina swamps or found freedom in northern cities, no one could say for certain. They had become legends. And legends never truly die. Today, visitors to rural North Carolina sometimes find old plantation foundations hidden in the woods. Tour guides tell sanitized stories about industrial accidents in 1858. They mention the unfortunate deaths that happened during Mardi Gras celebrations. But they never tell the real story. Local historians know the truth, though. Court records still exist. Newspaper accounts from Charlotte describe the manhunt for 2 suspected murderers. The bodies were never found. The case was never solved. Old folks in small Carolina towns still whisper different tales. They speak of 2 shadows seen near abandoned plantations during Carnival season. Visitors report strange feelings in empty cotton fields, voices that whisper about justice finally served during Mardi Gras night. Maybe they're still out there. 2 souls who refuse to stay silent. If this story amazed you, hit the like button. Share this with friends and family. Subscribe for more incredible historical mysteries.